Most people believe that if they wake up feeling fine, their body must be fine, but that assumption quietly misleads millions of older adults every single morning, and what I'm about to explain could completely change how you see your daily routine. So stay with me, because in a moment you'll understand why the first 10 minutes after waking up can be the most critical window for your heart, and later you'll see how simple habits may either support or strain your system without you realizing it. When you sleep, your body shifts into a low-demand state, almost like a car engine idling overnight. But as morning approaches, stress hormones like cortisol begin rising before you even open your eyes, a process well documented by organizations such as the NIH and Harvard Health, which explain how this natural wake-up signal prepares your body for activity, but also increases heart rate and blood pressure. And here's where it gets important, according to the American Heart Association. And supported by research indexed on PubMed, cardiovascular events are observed more frequently in the early morning hours, not because mornings are harmful by themselves, but because multiple physiological changes stack together at once. And in a moment, I'll break down those layers so you can actually picture what's happening inside your body. Imagine your blood vessels as flexible pipes and your blood as the fluid moving through them. During sleep, things flow slowly and smoothly, but in the morning, the pressure increases quickly. And if the pipes are a bit stiff, as can naturally happen with age according to sources like the Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic, the system has to work harder to adapt. Now add another layer that most people overlook: mild dehydration after several hours without water, something the NHS and WHO both note as a normal overnight effect, which can make blood slightly thicker and circulation a bit less efficient. And suddenly your heart is not just waking up, it's working against resistance. This doesn't mean something bad will happen, but it does explain why certain habits matter more than people think. And just to be clear, this is general educational information, not a diagnosis or personal medical advice. And if you have specific health concerns, you should always speak with a qualified professional who understands your individual history, because context matters more than any general guideline. Now here's where curiosity should really kick in, because what most people do next, getting up quickly, skipping hydration, or jumping straight into activity, can either help the body transition smoothly or make that natural morning shift more abrupt. And later you'll see exactly which common routines quietly increase strain and what small changes can support a more balanced start. Because once you understand the sequence, you begin to see that it's not about fear, it's about awareness, and what comes next will make that even clearer. What makes the morning window so unique is not just one single change in the body, but a cascade of events happening almost at the same time. And in a moment, you'll see how these changes layer on top of each other in a way that many people never stop to consider. And later you'll understand why even small habits during this period can have a noticeable impact. As your body transitions from sleep to wakefulness, your nervous system shifts from a calm, restorative mode into a more alert, active state, something widely described by institutions like the NIH and Harvard Health as part of the circadian rhythm, your internal 24-hour clock. And during this shift, hormones like cortisol and adrenaline naturally rise to help you feel awake and ready, but at the same time, they also signal your heart to beat faster and your blood vessels to tighten slightly, which increases blood pressure. And according to the American Heart Association and Mayo Clinic, this rise is a normal physiological response, yet it becomes more significant with age because blood vessels tend to lose some of their elasticity, meaning they don't expand as easily under pressure. Now here's where another layer quietly adds to the picture, and in a moment it will become clear why it matters more than most people think. During sleep, you go several hours without drinking water, and as noted by the NHS and WHO, this can leave you mildly dehydrated by morning, which may make your blood slightly more concentrated, not dramatically, but enough to require a bit more effort from the heart to circulate efficiently. And when you combine this with the natural morning rise in blood pressure, the system is already working harder before any physical movement even begins. Then there's circulation itself, because when you've been lying down for hours, blood distribution in your body is relatively even, but as soon as you wake and prepare to stand, gravity starts to shift blood toward your lower body, and the heart must quickly adjust to maintain stable flow to the brain, a response that the Cleveland Clinic and other clinical sources describe as a rapid coordination between the heart, blood vessels, and nervous system. And later you'll see why rushing this transition can sometimes create unnecessary strain. Another factor often overlooked is the body's increased tendency toward clotting in the early morning, something discussed in research compiled on PubMed and referenced by major cardiovascular organizations, where certain clotting factors are more active during these hours, likely as part of the body's natural rhythm, but when combined with thicker blood from mild dehydration and increased pressure from hormonal changes, it creates a situation where everything is slightly more reactive than usual. None of this means that mornings are dangerous by default, and it's important to keep this in perspective because these are normal biological processes, not problems on their own. And this information is meant for general education, not as a substitute for personalized medical advice, especially since individual health conditions can vary widely. But what it does highlight is how timing and behavior intersect with physiology. And in a moment, you'll start to see how common morning habits can either support this transition or make it more abrupt. Because once you understand how these internal changes stack together, the next step, what people typically do right after waking, becomes much more important than it first appears. Now that you understand what's happening inside the body during those first waking moments, the next piece of the puzzle is what people actually do during that time. And in a moment, you'll see how some of the most common morning habits can unintentionally add extra strain, while later you'll understand how small adjustments can make the transition much smoother. One of the biggest mistakes is getting out of bed too quickly, something that feels harmless but triggers a rapid shift in blood flow due to gravity. And according to clinical explanations from the Cleveland Clinic and NHS, when you move suddenly from lying down to standing, blood can pool in the lower body, forcing your heart to respond quickly to maintain circulation to the brain. And if that response is slightly delayed, as can happen with age, you may feel dizziness or lightheadedness, which many people dismiss, but it's actually a sign that the cardiovascular system is working harder to stabilize itself. In a moment, I'll explain why slowing this transition can be surprisingly effective. But first, there's another habit that quietly compounds the issue, and that is skipping hydration. Because after several hours without fluids, the body begins the day slightly dehydrated, something supported by general hydration guidance from the WHO and Mayo Clinic. And when you delay drinking water, your circulation system continues operating under less than ideal conditions, meaning the heart has to push a bit harder to move blood efficiently, especially during a time when pressure and heart rate are already elevated. Then comes a trend that has gained a lot of popularity, starting the day with cold exposure. And while cold showers are often discussed for alertness and mental resilience, timing plays a critical role. And according to physiological insights referenced by Harvard Health and the NIH, sudden exposure to cold can trigger a rapid constriction of blood vessels and a spike in heart rate, which is a natural survival response. But when layered on top of the existing morning surge, it can create a sharper increase in cardiovascular demand than many people realize. And later you'll see how adjusting the timing rather than eliminating the habit can make a difference. Another pattern worth paying attention to is jumping straight into intense physical activity, because while exercise is strongly supported by organizations like the CDC and American Heart Association for long-term health, they also emphasize gradual warm-up and appropriate timing, and going from complete rest to high exertion without preparation can amplify the stress already present in the morning state, especially when the body hasn't fully transitioned into an active mode yet. Once you start seeing how these habits stack on top of the body's natural morning changes, the next step is understanding what to do differently. And in a moment, you'll realize that the goal is not to avoid mornings or become overly cautious, but to guide your body through a smoother transition. And later, you'll see how simple adjustments can support your system without adding complexity. Think of your body like an engine that has been idle all night, and instead of revving it immediately, you allow it to warm up gradually, a concept that aligns with general cardiovascular guidance from sources like the American Heart Association and Harvard Health, which emphasize gradual changes in activity rather than sudden spikes, So the first shift is awareness. When you wake up, instead of reacting instantly, you pause for a few seconds and allow your breathing to settle, because slow, controlled breathing has been shown in research referenced by the NIH and Cleveland Clinic to support the parasympathetic nervous system, the part responsible for calming the body, which helps balance the natural rise in stress hormones. In a moment, I'll explain why this matters more than it sounds, but right after that pause comes hydration. And this is where a very simple habit can support multiple systems at once. Because as noted by the NHS and WHO, rehydrating after sleep helps restore fluid balance, which can support circulation and reduce the effort required by the heart to move blood effectively. And while it may seem like a small step, it directly addresses one of the layers we discussed earlier, slightly thicker blood in the morning. Then comes how you physically get up. And instead of moving abruptly, easing into a seated position gives your body time to adjust to gravity, something supported by clinical advice from institutions like the Mayo Clinic, which often recommend gradual position changes to help maintain stable blood pressure. And later you'll see how this single adjustment can also reduce the likelihood of dizziness or imbalance. Movement itself is the next piece, but not intense movement. Instead, gentle stretching or light motion helps increase circulation progressively, allowing the heart rate to rise at a manageable pace, which aligns with exercise principles promoted by the CDC and American Heart Association that highlight the importance of warm-up before more demanding activity. And this is where many people get it wrong, because they assume more intensity equals better results, when in reality, timing and progression matter just as much. Even something like your morning shower can follow this same logic, where starting with a comfortable temperature allows your body to adjust before introducing colder water if you choose to, reducing the sudden vascular response described in physiological studies referenced by Harvard Health. None of these steps are complicated, and this is not about strict rules or medical prescriptions. Just general educational guidance that should always be adapted based on personal health conditions in consultation with a qualified professional. But what makes this approach effective is how it works with your body's natural rhythm instead of against it. And in a moment, you'll see how putting these ideas together into a simple routine can create a consistent, supportive start to the day that feels almost effortless once it becomes a habit. When these small adjustments come together, they form a simple but structured way to start the day, and in a moment you'll see how this kind of routine is less about perfection and more about consistency, while later you'll understand why even partial adoption can still make a meaningful difference. Imagine your first few minutes after waking as a transition zone rather than a starting gun, where each step gently prepares your cardiovascular system for the demands ahead, a concept that aligns with preventive lifestyle approaches discussed by organizations like the American Heart Association and Harvard Health, which emphasize gradual activation instead of sudden stress. So the idea begins with controlled breathing, because slow, steady breaths can help balance the nervous system, as noted in NIH-supported research on autonomic regulation, allowing the body to counter the natural rise in cortisol and adrenaline rather than amplifying it. In a moment, I'll connect this to circulation, but right after breathing comes hydration, which may seem basic yet plays a foundational role, since the WHO and NHS both highlight the importance of maintaining fluid balance for normal physiological function. And by drinking water early, you are supporting blood flow at a time when it may be slightly more concentrated after sleep, making it easier for the heart to circulate efficiently. Then comes posture and movement, and instead of rushing to stand, sitting briefly allows your body to adapt to gravitational changes, something supported by clinical insights from the Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic regarding blood pressure stability. And later you'll see how this also connects to reducing sensations like dizziness that many people accept as normal. Gentle movement follows naturally from this position, and this is where light stretching or slow mobility work can help stimulate circulation without placing sudden demand on the heart, aligning with exercise. Recommendations from the CDC that stress the importance of warming up before engaging in more intense activity, because the goal is not to avoid movement but to sequence it properly. Even your next steps, Walking, preparing for the day, or eventually exercising can follow this same principle of gradual increase, and this layered approach mirrors what is often described in preventive health literature on PubMed, where small, consistent behaviors accumulate into broader lifestyle patterns over time. Another often overlooked element is awareness of how medications or nutritional status might interact with morning physiology. And while this is highly individual, institutions like the Mayo Clinic note that factors such as electrolyte balance, including minerals like magnesium, can influence normal muscle and nerve function, including the heart's rhythm, which is why general awareness and communication with a healthcare professional can be useful. None of this is about rigid rules or guarantees, and it's important to remember that these are general educational insights, not personalized medical instructions. But what makes this routine effective is how it reduces sudden stress on the system while supporting natural body functions. And in a moment, you'll see how bringing all of these elements together into a daily habit can shift the way your mornings feel, not just physically, but in terms of confidence and control over your routine. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, what becomes clear is that mornings are not something to fear, but something to understand and work with. And in a moment, you'll see how this shift in perspective can be more powerful than any single habit. While later you'll realize why long-term consistency matters far more than getting everything perfect on day one. The body is designed to handle change, but it responds best to gradual transitions rather than sudden demands, a principle consistently emphasized by organizations like the American Heart Association, Mayo Clinic, and Harvard Health, which all highlight lifestyle patterns such as balanced routines, steady movement, proper hydration, and stress awareness as key components of overall cardiovascular well-being. And when you align your morning with these principles, you're not adding extra effort. You're simply removing unnecessary strain. Think of it like guiding a system instead of forcing it, because as research discussed through NIH and PubMed resources suggests, the accumulation of small daily behaviors often has a greater long-term impact than occasional intense efforts. And in a moment, I'll explain why this matters beyond just the morning hours. Many people focus only on isolated actions, one workout, one meal, one habit, but the body responds to patterns, and your morning routine often sets the tone for everything that follows, influencing energy levels, movement choices, and even stress responses throughout the day, which is why institutions like the CDC and WHO often frame health guidance around daily habits rather than single events. At the same time, it's important to recognize that individual health situations vary widely, and nothing discussed here replaces personalized medical advice. So if you have existing conditions, symptoms, or concerns, speaking with a qualified healthcare professional who understands your history is always the right step, because general information must be adapted to individual needs. Another point that often gets overlooked is that awareness itself changes behavior, because once you understand what's happening inside your body, you naturally begin to make more intentional choices, whether that's pausing before getting up, hydrating earlier, or easing into activity. And later you'll notice that these small decisions start to feel automatic rather than forced. Over time, this creates a sense of control rather than uncertainty, and that psychological shift is just as important as the physical one, since stress and perception also influence how the body responds, something widely acknowledged in health education from sources like the NHS and Cleveland Clinic. Ultimately, the goal is not to create a rigid routine, but to build a flexible, supportive pattern that respects how your body functions. And while no routine can eliminate all risk or guarantee outcomes, aligning your habits with well-established physiological principles gives you a stronger foundation for daily life. And as a final reminder, this is general educational information meant to support awareness, not diagnose, treat, or replace professional care. But if you take anything from this, let it be this simple idea. In a moment of awareness each morning, you have an opportunity to support your body instead of rushing past it. And that choice, repeated over time, is where real impact begins.